Shalom, shalom, friends. Blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of Un-Apologetics, where we are unapologetic about apologetics, and I'm your host, CJ Cox. Had a little bit later than I actually intended, but I do apologize for that. We are here just about 2-3 minutes after the intended time. So appreciate you guys being here with us today. I do have some people already waiting in the back room. You guys, just so you know, will be allowed here very, very quickly. I just want to say a few brief words, and then I'll go ahead and open this room up. Room is open, by the way, so everybody knows. Please do read the rules. I'm very strict with them. But so long as you do meet those rules, you're certainly welcome to come in. I do have a couple people who I'm going to give priority to. I'll go ahead and name them off so everybody's aware. And the reason I'm giving priority to these people is because I have heard them vocalize criticisms that they would like to, that I assume at least that they would like to share. And they're pertaining to these three issues. So, as well as the fact that Standing just hosted it. So Standing, Michael the Canadian Atheist, Dr. Kenny Rhodes, Smokey Saint, Salvific Deputy, and if this happens to get around to people like Matt Powell or anything like that, as well as if we want people like Praise or Jamie, who I knew had some questions, those guys are certainly welcome as well. But those first that I just mentioned, since they voiced their criticisms or hosted the debate, do get the first priority, and of course that won't be filling up the whole thing. I have, I think, possibility of 10, so there'll be room for other people, even if everyone shows up, which I doubt. Nonetheless, go through a couple brief channel housekeeping things first. Number one, want to remind you guys that there is another debate coming up on the Gospel Truth. It's going to be my first ever debate on the Gospel Truth channel. I'll be debating Rob Rowe of Sentinel Apologetics on the question of whether or not the Bible teaches a literal global flood. I'll be taking the position it does, and he'll be taking the Persian Gulf flood position. So that'll be certainly very interesting. And again, that's going to be on July the 1st. At an unspecified time so far on Standing for Truth's channel, I'll also be debating with Smokey Saint on the question, does the Bible teach conditional immortality? Or I think the direct way we're wording the thesis so far, at least, is the soul conditionally immortal? And I'll be taking the position that it is. I am an annihilationist. He will be taking the position that it does not. That should be over on Standing for Truth's channel. A couple other things that we do have in the works, but they're not official yet, so I don't actually want to go out of my way to announce them, just in case they do end up falling through. The last thing I do want to briefly say as far as channel housekeeping is concerned is those of you guys who do like my political content, please do remember it is no longer on this channel. I know it's been about a month since it left, but some people still haven't watched this in the last month, so it's perfectly fine. It is over on the Synagogue News YouTube channel. So definitely check that out if you're interested in that. If you're not interested in that and you really just want to look at the stuff that I'm talking about here on this channel, that would be perfectly fine. So after that, then, of course, last thing I want to get to that's not channel housekeeping, but just the last thing before we open everything up, is my opinions on the last three things that have happened. This is a challenge CJ stream. It doesn't mean you have to challenge me. You can totally come in and voice your support. You can also totally come in and challenge me on something that is not one of the three topics, namely young earth, annihilation, not annihilation, excuse me, why you believe, which are the two debates that I had, or reprobate theology in the NIFB. But I wanted to briefly say a recap of what I view on those three things, and then, of course, we'll get on to here. By the way, Mine Ben, yes, you certainly can come on. I know I've never spoken with you, in voice to voice, but you've been around this channel long enough to where I think I could advocate for you. So yeah, you'd absolutely be able to come on. At any rate, so I want to say in regards to the reprobation thing, my view is quite simple. The Bible condemns homosexuality in the harshest of terms. It also condemns numerous other things in the harshest of terms. The person who believes in reprobate theology from the NIFB perspective, specifically from the NIFB perspective, there are numerous correct understandings of reprobation. I want to point that out. That person makes the error of assuming that there is something special about homosexuality that makes it different from other sins, that makes a person who is homosexual not able to be saved. I disagree with that. I will take on anybody who wants to take me on any particular portion of that, whether they say that the Bible doesn't teach it's a sin. Yes, it does. I'll take you on that, absolutely. And if you say that the Bible teaches we should stone homosexuals and that they can't be saved, I'll take you on that as well, because that's not correct. And that's the reprobate video. The other video there, of course, I did with Kenny Rhodes, that debate that was on the young earth versus the old earth. The Bible very clearly teaches a young earth, in my opinion. Obviously people have disagreements with me on that, but I think the only possible way you can understand old earth from the coming from the book of Genesis is if you create a context that does not actually exist, based in your own understandings from whatever culture you happen to come from, whether that be some of the old Greeks or some of the modern people dealing with the modern scientific paradigm. And then the last one was, of course, the debate I just had. That's probably the one that a lot of you guys are familiar with because you probably just came over from watching it. I believe there are very solid reasons to believe in the God of the Bible. It seems to me like most people's reasons for not believing the God of the Bible have to do either with the irrationality of the miraculous, science in some way indicating that the Bible is not true, or the problem of evil, I think, is a lot bigger amongst the younger generation than the older generation. But of course, it was brought up by Michael. And I think there are solid answers for that, namely the fact that I think that science proves miracles in a lot of different ways and proves God in a lot of different ways. And I think the fact that there is evidence for miracles, which are from a naturalistic perspective irrational, does certainly indicate that there is indeed a God who is able to do things from a supranaturalistic perspective. And with all of that being said, very brief, of course, because I want to just get right into the conversation, dropping the live chat in the, or dropping the, link into the live chat. It's also in the description. I'll get it pinned here in a moment. And I do have a rational empiricist already here with me. So let's go ahead and get right into everything. And Shalom, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I think this is my first time around this channel, so I appreciate you letting me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think this is actually, not only that, I think it's the first time I've actually spoken with you. If I understand correctly, maybe not. Maybe at some point.
I'm pretty sure, yeah, that would make sense.
Anyways, though, how's it going? I think I'm just going to take a wild guess and say by the name a rational empiricist, you probably will lean more on the naturalism, atheism side. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think me personally, I would, I like to call myself a teapot atheist just because I like the analogy proposed by Bertrand Russell. I don't know how many people go with that view, but personally, I do hold to the theory of evolution and Big Bang cosmology and things like that. So, yeah.
Okay. Absolutely. And so you were saying you wanted to ask me some questions on evolution itself, I believe, right?
Yeah, I mean, if we can get into it, if we have time, I don't want to take up other people's time as well. So I understand if you want to spread that out.
Yeah, that's certainly all right. So far, you're the only one in. We do have 18 people in the viewership so far, so we might get some people joining here soon. But so far, you're the only one who's wanted to join. So by all means, ask away.
Oh, okay. I think, we'll see if Mindbank can join as well. I was talking with him in the live chat, and we were just having a nice cordial discussion, but we'll see. So I guess. Do you mind if I ask some questions about your own position on evolution?
Certainly.
So me personally, I'm very interested in the field within evolutionary biology known as phylogenetics. And I guess first and foremost, do you have any particular opinions or positions on phylogenetics and common descent in general?
So I will say a couple things. The first being that I will have to definitely clarify everything I say by saying science is not my main interest, and when I am interested in science, I tend to be more interested in zoology, and paleontology as well, but the idea basically being animals. That said, And the only reason I say that is just to say that, you know, I'm not an expert for sure.
Right.
I wouldn't take a scientific.
I'm not either. So
right. However, that said, I would say that I don't believe in common descent for a couple of reasons. There are reasons that would probably sound superficial to somebody who was a little bit more informed, but I do think they are solid reasons.
okay.
And I'll give just one of them because I don't want to bog down the conversation with, you know, snowballing or anything like that. But so the breeding of dogs is a perfect example. There are, I think, 410 or something like that recognized breeds of dog if you go by all the different kennel clubs and not just one or the other.
Right.
And there's likely even some more than that if you counted for non-recognized breeds. For example, Greek Shepherds and Alaskan Huskies and things like that. And so you could probably, let's just say, a solid 500 breeds of dogs in the world, although we could only confirm closer to 400. Now, one of the interesting things about that is we can narrow down the genetics of dogs to what you would call the originals. And it doesn't mean they're literally the original dog breeds, but just that they're the ones that we seem to have evidence of being the oldest. And I can't list them all off the top of my head, but there's 13 of them is the primary point. So if you subtract 13 from 500, obviously you're only at 487. You basically not even made a dent, meaning that we've managed to take the species Canis lupus and create 487 at least breeds of dog within a period of less than 4,000 years. And you can make that even worse when you account for the fact that roughly 300 of those breeds of dog are actually less than 500 years old. For example, there would be the German Shepherd, the Pit Bull, the French Bulldog, so on and so forth. Alaskan Huskies, right? A lot of these breeds of dogs. Some of them are kind of obvious because they don't look like wolves, right?
Right.
But the general point being that, number one, we do have evidence that one animal, one species, even because let's keep in mind the Chihuahua is still, from a species perspective, a wolf. It is a Canis lupus.
Right. Right.
We can not only get one species to exhibit extreme diversity in a short period of time, which would account for, I think, why there's so many different variations, but also, despite that extreme variation, they don't seem to ever even leave their species classification, let alone their actual genus classification. I mean, what we've done to dogs, in my opinion, would probably be at least 10 times as far as speeding up the process of what we might consider to be adaptation. And yet there doesn't appear to be any major speciation differences. I've heard some people say it could be as much as 100 times. I mean, that would put us back to, I think dog domestication took place the first time 30,000 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. This is according to their paradigm. I don't agree with according to that. So that'd be 300,000 years ago. I mean, no evolution in 300,000 years is quite impressive, right? Are not impressive, quite the opposite word actually, is not impressive, right? And so it seems to me like, even though that's sort of a guesstimation, we don't know for a fact that it's 300,000 years worth of adaptation. It seems likely, and I don't know. It seems to me like that kind of proves that you don't really get species to leave at least their genus, but especially their actual species itself, is what the dog seems to indicate.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good criticism. I guess the only way I might respond to that would be might be the usual response. I don't know if you've heard this one, but basically, since we as human beings are intelligent, at least by most standards, we can kind of sculpt nature the way we want it without necessarily going through this trial and error process. So, like, for instance, dogs, like pit bulls and probably other breeds, probably have deformities that wouldn't really exist if they were in the wild, per se. So I think, to me at least, I feel like it can be explained by evolution, because when, of course, you're considering animals in the wild, you're considering many, many, many factors that are at work all at once. And so I guess that's the way I would respond to that, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Yeah, I do think you are. I do have a response to the example though there, which is I think that there is a little bit of another key to adaptation that breeding reveals to us. That, in my opinion, would not only account for what you said, but would also be a problem if adaptation did actually lead to evolution. And that is that it does appear to be degenerative. And I think dog breeding very clearly shows that. The wolf is to use the word in its more poetic sense, the wolf is a specimen, you know what I mean? Like, that thing it's very impressive. It's fast, it's strong, it's brilliant. It's very emotionally intelligent, very adaptive. It can be anything it can be a 35-pound animal and live perfectly fine, or a 180-pound animal and live perfectly fine, depending on what its environment demands. Right. Versus, say a Chihuahua, which is specially Canis lupus, is kind of useless even for its own environment. And I don't even say that disrespectfully to the dog, but it really couldn't live without human intervention. And in every way seems to have degenerated. It's not very adaptive. It doesn't have proper pack mentality, really. It's actually kind of a vicious dog, really, when it comes to hanging out with other dogs, mainly because it fears for its life constantly. It doesn't appear to be something that could take down any sort of the substantial prey, I guess would be the word. It'd have to be something like a rodent fighter or something like that.
Right.
And you could argue whether or not a small dog could even take on rodents and stuff like that, because, cats and ferrets and badgers and other animals that eat rodents are pretty well adapted to it. Dogs, on the other hand, are not. Dogs are actually kind of clunky. They don't have slicing claws, and they're not very flexible, and their legs almost always just are straight. They bend almost barely. All these other kind of things that would make it very difficult for them to hunt a rodent. Right. The point just being that I think dog breeding shows us that adaptation, though it will lead to certain benefits for sure. For example, I think a bulldog in a one-on-one fight is probably a better fighter than a wolf, because it was bred specifically to fight, bred by bulls in that example. But even though it's good at that, and it's specifically adapted to get to that point, it degenerated in all of its other ways. And I think that gives us an insight into what adaptation actually does. It does allow us to be good at certain things, but at the risk of losing other things.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. Like, in terms of, for example, extinction events, which I know obviously you don't think like extinctions happened millions of years ago, but like, for instance, if according to the theory of evolution, if you had a major extinction event, say from an asteroid impact or volcanic eruptions like the ones that happened in Siberia in the Permian period, you would have a lot of the specialists die out, and it kind of happens to be chance which ones kind of make it through because they're more generalist. So I think it kind of depends, and I think life is kind of, I think you would agree, is kind of tenacious, and that you try and get rid of it, but almost always wherever you try and get rid of it or try and find it where it's not supposed to be is basically already there. So
yeah, it's kind of like the Jurassic Park quote, right? Life finds a way, right?
right. Yeah.
And it is true, certainly. And I would even go as far as to say that I don't find there to be anything necessarily irrational about extinction events. I just don't think that they're true, right?
Right.
But I do believe there, though, that you do see a level of, even in extinction events, there kind of the same general thing where diversification and to use a kind of crude term, quality of the species does seem to decrease over time. Now, there is an exception to that, I'll admit, in that birds and mammals, by the evolutionary paradigm, show up much later, and they are the most complex species. But in numerous other ways, like, for example, reptiles, the evolutionary model would say that reptiles are incredibly old, of course, even pre-dinosaurian. And, for all intents and purposes, reptiles kind of suck in the modern world, right? Like, they're not very impressive when it comes to the majority of creatures. Mammals and birds are the dominant creatures on this planet.
Right. I think the only exception to that would be if you're a wildebeest and you're walking across the river.
Yeah, exactly, right. But crocodiles are even hunted by lions, right? Although lions, to be fair, those things end up pretty brutal, and lions will sometimes very, very often die to try and get that meal. But the point is, in the end, the lion is dominant in that area, and not this gargantuan crocodile. And of course, in the past, that crocodile was dwarfed by like a Dinosuchus, which has complete and total dominance over the region. Even the largest African cats, and in fact, I think the American lion is the largest cat we've ever found, something like 1,000 pounds, absolutely dwarfed by a Dinosuchus.
Oh yeah.
And on top of that, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the American lion was actually a solo animal because it was so big. It wasn't able to hunt enough food to maintain pride.
I mean, like, put it into perspective, you could fit one of those things in the Dinosuchus's mouth.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like, that's a massive cat, and yet Dinosuchus could literally just... Like, in fact, I just went to South Dakota, I got back, I think, 4 days ago. Anyways, and being a lifelong lover of prehistoric animals and animals in general, we ended up going to the museum and stuff like that.
Oh, nice.
I actually was able to, look at a Dinosuchus skull. Of course, had to be reconstructed, but most of it was real.
Right.
And the skull of this thing itself is almost as long as I am. Yep. Which is like, I mean, that's an insane thing to think about, right? And of course, that's not even the biggest one. Another one that I looked at there's the largest complete skeleton of a mosasaur down there in Hill City.
Oh, yeah, those things were scary.
Yeah, I mean, I actually, because it hangs over you, and so I decided to do a little test, right? I sat there and like actually examined to see if I could lay down inside of its rib cage. And the thing is, not only could I, but the rib cage was so big that I could likely have laid down in its stomach. I don't know, because there's no stomach there, you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
It's such a massive animal. Modern reptiles are just not that way. And even with mammals, mammals are seemingly not as impressive as they were. I mean, a mammoth is not an elephant, and a woolly rhino is not a rhino. A dire wolf isn't even a gray wolf, although you could kind of argue about that in a way, because gray wolves are a very impressive creature.
Right. Yeah, oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. I've been going on.
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying in terms of complexity. I think the only thing to consider, in my opinion, would be sometimes complexity doesn't always count as much in terms of evolution, because, say, for instance, insects, they're not very complex in terms of like nervous systems and things like that, but they outnumber us like 200 million to 1. So I think in some instances, complexity alone doesn't indicate how kind of much it's going for it. You know what I mean?
Certainly, and I'll even, and I do after this want to toss to Mindbend, just because I don't want to.
Yeah, certainly.
But I will say, I do have a level of agreement with that for sure, especially considering one of the first things you find after an area is laid waste, regardless of how. It could be an army, it could be bombs, it could be natural disaster. Sure. Even before plants, bugs seem to show up. And
yeah, that would make sense.
Also, plants, do tend to show up quite a bit as well.
And fungi.
Yeah, exactly, right. And neither one of those are necessarily incredibly complex. So I certainly do see what you mean there. But they're also never incredibly dominant either.
Right.
it's like, so you win some, you lose some in a way. And that's, I guess, all I could say on that, because I'm not too familiar with a lot of insect things. I'll be honest with you.
Right. I guess the last thing I will say before we let Mindbend speak would be there, in the fossil record at least, there was a time before the dinosaurian era where, like, I think I'm roboting.
A little bit, but I think you're coming back also.
Yeah, I seem to have that trouble in other streams. Like, whenever everyone else mutes, I start roboting.
That is interesting. I actually will not mute then.
Okay. Sorry about that. Not trying to cause an inconvenience.
Oh, you're totally fine. You're totally fine.
So I was just saying, like, have you heard of the fossil Jacolopterus?
I do not think so, actually.
Yeah, so it's pretty intimidating. It's basically one of the Eurypterids, the sea scorpions, and it's like over 9 feet, I think, long. So it's like the size of a crocodile, but it's an arthropod. So, yeah. Anyways.
My man do want to go ahead and pass to you for a little bit. I know you definitely wanted to come in and join. How's it going, Shalom?
Hello. Can you both hear me on the mic?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right.
Yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah, I often have some mic issues, so just want to make sure. Okay, so I guess well, I don't really think even within the naturalistic worldview that the idea of evolution really explains too much at all, and that's because there are, like, within a naturalistic worldview, there are certain events that happen in what's believed to be the history of life. So
Right.
you have well, one if first. So first there would be the origin of mitochondria and chloroplasts. The next obvious event would like the origin of eukaryotes. And the next obvious one would be like on the origin of multicellular life. And then you can kind of climb up to where you get to some transitions that under this paradigm would climb up to humans. Now the issue is that many of these changes, in according to the standard time scale, of course, of like, long ages and stuff.
Sure.
Many of this stuff took so long to happen that it actually doesn't make much sense to say that these happen because of adaptive changes per se. Like, if it took say billions of years for well, like if it took, like, say, a billion years for the first eukaryote to start, then it's pretty doubtful to say that there's anything. Hold on one second.
Real quick, while we have some dead air, I just want to go ahead and acknowledge both Otangelo and Crimson Air. Thank you guys for joining us today. Shalom.
Good afternoon, CJ. Thanks for
Yes,
having
hi
me on.
guys.
And absolutely, and again, thank you for being on here. I don't know when Mindbend will be back, and I don't want to cut off his thought, but also want to go ahead and let you guys give some thoughts if you wanted. Did you guys have any thoughts on any of the 3 topics, or on the one that we were talking about right now?
Yes, I would like to ask Andrew. Andrew, what is your main evidence for evolution? And with evolution, I mean common ancestry, universal common ancestry, and the tree of life. That is the claim that all life forms descend from one common ancestor.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. So I don't personally know too much about the chemistry of life, so I can't really speak on how the major domains are related. I do think they are related, but I can't really speak on that. So what I do think is good evidence for common ancestry in general is the fact that when you look at the traits of different organisms, you see a statistical dependence between various traits, and it mostly, for the most part, depends on where you pick them out from the phylogenetic tree. So whether you pick them out from random, or whether you pick them out from a place where you would presume they're closely related, like sister species. So that the technical term for that is what's called phylogenetic signal. It's the statistical dependence of traits based on their phylogenetic relationships. And I think in terms of that, good evidence for common ancestry in general would be the fact that when you look at the major clades of life, in particular animals, which creationists I think would say aren't necessarily related, when you look at their signal, they show a very, very high signal in general. So I think that is by itself good evidence that some kind of relationship exists.
I would say that if you don't have an understanding on a biochemistry level, Andrew, then you are basically empty-handed, because it's on that level that actually the mechanisms are operating actually to make all the features of differentiation of the cells and so forth. So I think that you're operating basically on a very shallow fundament, for scientific fundament. I don't think that this is a good approach.
Like if you're talking about like genetics, for instance, I understand more about genetics, but like and the biochemistry behind how changes in genes can lead to changes in morphology. Like you mentioned, cell differentiation, but like I meant more so in terms of the chemistry of ribosomes, for instance. I have no idea about that. That's beyond my understanding right now. So that's what I meant on that.
Well, the origin of the ribosome has nothing to do with evolution, because the ribosome had to be fully operational when life started, right?
Again, I can't really speak on that because I don't have the expertise to talk about that subject.
Right. I mean, I think it is staggering, Andrew, that you make the rounds on so many YouTube streams where I encounter you, and you are a very outspoken defender of evolution, and are just demonstrating that you have not an adequate scientific education in order to do that.
Well, like if you're talking about, well, I try my best to learn about these subjects, but I can't learn about everything all at once.
Then why don't you first learn about the subjects, and when you have actually an understanding, even on genetics, on biochemistry, and in special in regards of epigenetics and systems biology and and evolutionary biology, because it is something which is related to several fields, and it really requires many years of study in order to have even, I would say, a superficial understanding of the mechanisms which are in place. Why don't you hold up a decision or a view in regards of that topic, in regards of how organisms came and biodiversity came to be, until you actually acquire that understanding, and then say, I believe this or that is the mechanisms because this of that, and you can actually really substantiate it and remain agnostic in regards of that issue.
Well, for two main reasons, because the evidence I've accumulated so far, while not in its while not the total amount of evidence, is still significant to convince me that some kind of evolution was there. And second, even though I don't have a complete understanding of evolution, I have talked to people or emailed them, etc., who do study these fields. And although I myself am not an expert, I think I'm going to trust the people who are experts, and most of them say that evolution is true.
Oh, okay. So now we are starting to get the real picture. You are basically operating on believing in authority without having actually an understanding yourself.
No, that's not really an argument from authority.
Well, you just confess that you believe what your experts, those which you actually contact, what they say, and I suppose they are all. Is there one creationist amongst them?
There probably are, but it's not the majority. And when the reason that's not an argument from authority is because if I were able to specify, I would say because they're not because they are experts does not necessarily mean they are correct. Just that they are experts. I am not an expert, so I'm going to trust them in terms of these issues because they are more likely to be correct in the fact that they have studied these topics pretty much their entire lives. So it's not really an argument from authority as much as trusting your auto mechanic, for instance, because you don't know much about mechanics, but they do. You don't necessarily know that they're correct, but they're more likely to be correct just because they have expertise in that subject.
Well, I understand that you want to have an answer, and it is an important issue, of course. But I'll be honest with you, I think this is not a good epistemic approach.
Well, like in terms of abiogenesis or evolution, or what exactly are you talking about?
I am talking about the entire approach which you are exposing right now. I mean, I don't do that. What I do is I educate myself, even as a layman. I have no academic.
Well, I do that too.
Yeah, I don't have an academic diploma, but I can actually access books about evolution and science papers about evolution and study the topic and then make up my mind in regards of the topic and the issue at hand. And I mean, this is, in my understanding, the only way where you can get to a real understanding and then make up your mind.
Well, I never said I didn't do that. I look at the evidence as well, and I try to learn as best as I can. But like on the subjects that I'm not as familiar with, I need to put it in their hands until I can learn about those subjects more in depth, which of course is going to take some time.
Well, that's precisely the issue, because as I said previously, the mechanisms which are in play to construct complex organisms, they are on a biochemical level. They are in regard. It is in regards of genetic and epigenetic information. It is about signaling. It is about G. And true is that nobody has actually still a real or even close understanding of these mechanisms. I have collected 43 different genetic languages and codes which are in operation, and science has probably a superficial understanding of 2 or 3. how that information is actually stored. But in regards of all the other epigenetic codes and languages, science doesn't have an understanding even about the code itself, what it means. And that means that science is still at the beginning, even after so many decades of study, to unravel these levels of complexity in organisms. So
Yeah, sure. No one said science and the scientific process was complete by any stretch of the imagination.
it is not only not complete, but we know that organisms really change, that they adapt to the environment. We know that there is pre-programmed evolution in order for organisms to be able to survive in different environments, and they change physically, physiologically. We know that. But the big issue, which is always in dispute, which is how do we explain the origin of biodiversity, and if the tree of life and universal common ancestry is true, this issue is not settled. And people like you run around and make believe that the issue is settled, and it's not.
I didn't say it was settled.
Yes,
there are
but
always details being figured out.
Yes, but you have already taken the stance that evolution is true, have you not?
Just because there are holes in a specific theory and details being worked out doesn't mean I am agnostic to the entire theory.
Yeah, so basically it is an evolution of the gaps, right?
No, it's not, because when you're looking, it's an accumulation of evidence. It's consilience of evidence. So like when you're looking at the data as a whole and you're looking to specific parts of it, when you find a piece of evidence that doesn't fit with the whole, it's something to look at, but it doesn't mean that the rest of the evidence isn't correct or anything.
Well, that is simply not true, what you are saying right now. And it is not true because you have confessed that you don't know, even on a biochemistry level where actually the action happens, what it is there that happens. You have confessed that.
Sure, but I know people who do.
So you are using basically blind belief and run around making it believe that you have actually knowledge on the matter, while you are confessing right now you don't. You just rely on information from others.
No, I learn about this stuff all the time, so it's not simply based on what I hear from others. I'm doing both, essentially.
Okay. I will give you a list here of 19 different mechanisms, and I want you to tell me which of those is not in operation to explain organismal complexity. Okay? 1, the gene regulation network. 2, various signaling pathways. 3, at least 43 epigenetic codes. 4, cell-cell communication. 5, chromatin dance in the nucleus. 6, post-transcriptional modifications of histones. 7, the DNA methylation code. 8, homeobox and Hox gene expression. 9, non-coding DNA, junk DNA. 10, transposons and retrotransposons. 11, centrosomes. 12, the precise arrangement of cytoskeletal arrays. 13, membrane targets. 14, ion channels and electromagnetic fields. 15, the sugar code. 16, egg polarity genes. 17, hormones. 18, morphogenes, growth factors. And 19, the adhesion code. Which one of those do you think is not involved in the construction of complex body plans?
Well, I wouldn't disagree with any of them.
Good. And you're correct. All of those are actually employed in a joint venture. Even the different signaling pathways, they work together. There are different languages in the body which can communicate with each other. And this, what I just exposed to you right now, goes far beyond just the genetic level, far beyond. And lots of it must be pre-programmed information and signaling languages. You cannot evolve these languages. But that's belief, right, Andrew?
Well, how do you know they can't evolve?
The genetic code, for example, isn't even a question of evolution. It is a question of the origin of life, and you need to have it fully operational when life started, right?
Wait, so we were talking about evolution, and now we're talking about the origin of life. Why did we switch topics?
Well, it is actually the genetic code is fundamental and is part of evolution, right?
Yes, but that doesn't mean that the theory attempts to explain where it came from.
Okay, we have. Do you know how many different genetic codes we have?
No. I'm not a geneticist.
Okay, we have 33 different genetic codes. Okay. So we have, for example, a different genetic code in mitochondria. Do you know that?
Well, like, I'm pretty sure I've at least heard that there is one or at most a few genetic codes, mainly the code from DNA to mRNA to amino acids.
That's not a different genetic code.
Right, I'm saying most of the codes I've heard about, at least, are based on that one.
That has nothing to do what you just said with the genetic code. Do you know what the genetic code is, actually?
Not specifically.
Okay, you see, Andrew, you can understand it in a very basic 101 biology level.
Otangelo, if I may, just to try to help out in addressing Andrew, the crux of what Otangelo is trying to get across is that the Darwinian model flies in contravention of what we know about plain statistics, mathematics, and as Dr. Hugh Ross once said, if you're going to work in the field of evolution, you have to incorporate mathematics into it. And
right.
The overwhelming problem with the Darwinian model is that the sole mechanism which accounts for genetic complexity is random mutation, which is to say random deviation. Would you accept that?
I would say that's what generates the variation on which those structures emerge, but I wouldn't say that's the only mechanism per se.
But you think it is just on a genetic level, Andrew?
What is variation?
What provokes physiological change and evolution?
It's not all on a genetic level, but I would say most of it is. Most of the relevant variation is.
So what else is?
Well, there are things like phenotypic plasticity and epigenetic mechanisms you mentioned, but I'm not as familiar with those. I don't think that those really matter as much to evolution.
If you want to continue, otherwise I reply Crimson Air.
Concerning genetic complexity, I think an important distinction to make from the start is that while you can get complexity from random changes, like if you take two buckets of paint, one blue, one white, and you toss them both onto a blank canvas, you'll get complex different patterns and shapes. Now, the differentiation is to be made between complexity and functional genetic complexity, where you have a system where each of the parts are interdependent, where if you make change to one, you have to sequentially make changes in the right order and in the right timing to all of the rest of the parts. So with random mutation, which is to say random deviation, taking away, adding on, twisting, turning, you can get periodic emergence of order, complexity. But to have it occur in such a way that you have all the mechanisms come together at once, that takes intelligence, and that's the argument that we're making. And so, like you said, you defer to the experts, the professional proponents of evolution. What would you say is, to the best of your knowledge, the most promising aspect of evolution that can account for the absence of intelligence in the context of emerging complexity, functional complexity?
Like you're talking irreducible complexity in a sense, right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Irreducible in the sense that if you want to increase it, you have to increase it in a way that's not detrimental to the system.
Right. Well, I think one of the ways, the one I'm most familiar with, is co-option, basically. Like no one says, for instance, that a feature with X function always necessarily had X function. It could have had Y function in the past. And in fact, when we look, and this is why I think phylogenetics is important as well, but like when we look through the animal kingdom, for instance, we can see different variations on a theme, and we can kind of connect the dots, not in terms of those particular species, but in terms of those morphologies, those structures. So like we're not saying, for instance, A species evolved into B species, etc. We're saying that the structure in A species is reminiscent of a precursor structure that could have been co-opted into the B structure, basically. Like an example would be feathers and birds and dinosaurs, and obviously dinosaurs couldn't fly. But our current explanation is they were used for some other purpose and then were co-opted for flight. Does that make sense?
It doesn't. These are
if you take the similar structure aspect and if you run with that, then what you're basically saying is that well, first I would say that you're making an inference where creationists will look at it as common design, and an evolutionist can look at it as a common structure. But that doesn't overcome the problem of genetic complexity, where, like you said, with feathers, you could have that passed on from one species to another and change. But in addition to that, you have an entire host of other genetic features that you have to accommodate in changing all of those along with it in order to have a harmonious functioning system being the end result.
Right,
so
right.
Instead of just feathers, you would have to say feathers, the genes that help initiate the divergence of the bone structures in the development of the feathering, the feather growth process, and everything else that is tied in with that from one generation to the next, and adding in changes, adding in small changes here and there throughout the entire system, and still have that being a coherent functioning system many generations down the line.
Right.
So Andrew, let me ask you something. In order to go from a unicellular eukaryotic organism to a multicellular organism, you need to specify the differentiation of the cells. Like a neuron is completely different than a blood cell or any other kind of cell, right? Like
Correct.
okay, so do you know what is involved in order to make that differentiation?
Right. Well, that's the whole subject of embryology, cells communicating with one another, basically.
Okay, let me give you a list here. Explaining organism or form, I will read here. Explaining organism or form depends on explaining how organs, tissues, and cells form and gain shape. On the lowest level of the hierarchy, the formation of cells in a multicellular organism depends on the specification of 1. The morphogenesis of eukaryotic cells, structure and shape. 2. Cell fate determination and differentiation, that is the phenotype or what cell type each one will become. 3. The cell growth and size. 4. The development and cell division counting. Cells need to be programmed to stop self-replicating after the right number of cell divisions. 5. Mechanisms of pattern formation. 6. Hox genes. 7. Position and place in the body. This is crucial. Limbs like legs, fins, eyes, etc. must be placed at the right place. 8. What communication it requires to communicate with other cells and the setup of the communication channels. 9. Sensory and stimuli functions of the cells. 10. What specific new regulatory functions do cells have to acquire? 11. When will the development program of the organism express the genes to the new cell to develop? 12. Change regulation in the composition of the cell membrane and or secreted products. 13. Specification of the cell-cell adhesion proteins and which ones will be used in each cell to adhere to the neighbor cells. There are 4 classes. 14. Apoptosis, programming of the time period the cell keeps alive in the body and when it is time to self-destruct and be replaced by newly produced cells of the same kind. 15. Set up each cell-specific nutrition demands. 16. Cell shape changes. 17. Cell proliferation is the process that results in an increase in the number of cells and is defined by the balance between the cell divisions and cell loss through cell death and differentiation. And 18, differences in regulatory DNA. So you see there are several items here which depend on specified and information which has to be injected all at once in order to change a cell and specify it. And you cannot do that gradually. It has to be injected all at once. And there are things like, for example, signal cell-cell communication and cell adhesion has to emerge simultaneously. Because if you have, for example, cell-cell signaling and communication, but the cells do not stick together, there is no deal. And the inverse is as well the same problem. If they stick together, but there is no communication, no deal. So this means that there are many processes here which have to merge together. And if one is lacking or missing, no deal. So that is actually something which also depends on leaders.
So you're basically saying that if they don't evolve all at once, then a morphological structure can evolve?
Yes, there has to be an injection of a huge quantity of information right from the beginning, and also the information which permits the or in single cell to adapt to the environment. And that is, there is a little bit of natural selection and the commonly used evolutionary mechanisms. They play a role, but they play a minor role. Most of the adaptation and plasticity, which you mentioned, it is pre-programmed.
Well, I think, well, we have structures that have, we've found genetic differences such that we know how these structures evolve. We have examples of morphological structures evolving even with the things you mentioned. For instance, like a good example would be the ducks. Oh, am I echoing?
Yeah, I know what you want to say. I mean, secondary speciation, this isn't the dispute here. What we are disputing is primary speciation, which is the new emergence of new features like photosynthesis, for example, which is extremely complex. It depends on 26 protein complexes which have to work in a joint venture together. And it had to emerge right at the beginning. The first cells that the science is describing are cyanobacteria, which supposedly emerged 3.7 billion years ago, right at the beginning of the evolutionary timeline. And science doesn't have an explanation how photosynthesis evolved, precisely because of that integrated necessity.
Well, I think that has been addressed by other people, but what you said new features, for instance, and I don't think new in this context has any real meaning, because when you're talking about evolution, you can't build something out of nothing.
Well, that is precisely what you would actually have to explain. For example, if you take the supposed universal common ancestor, it was living in a anaerobic environment without oxygen. Okay. Now, the interesting thing is that the first cells which we know of, which are cyanobacteria, they produce oxygen, right? They produce oxygen, but
Yeah.
there are many proteins which are shoot up if they are exposed to oxygen. So it would have killed the cyanobacteria if there wouldn't be protective mechanisms right from the beginning to protect these proteins from oxygen. And this is a paradox which science has no explanation for.
Well, we're talking about new features, and you kind of changed the subject to, well,
No,
this feature is...
that's what I'm talking about. At the first life form, which was that supposed universal common ancestor, it didn't photosynthesize. But the first life form that science describes are cyanobacteria 3.7 billion years ago. And these were photosynthesis performing organisms. So you have to explain in a very short period of interval from an anaerobic organism at the beginning of life until the first described unicellular cyanobacteria, and in that happened that evolution of higher photosynthesis complex. Okay, and you can search the scientific literature, and you will see that there will be assertions, but no really scientific explanation.
You're roboting a bit.
There are no precursors for oxygenic photosynthesis.
Well, I'm pretty sure there are, because I know people have talked to you about this, but myself...
Maybe people have talked with me about the topic, but even Robert Blankenship, which is one of the leading authorities, he has written books on photosynthesis, he confesses that it is a mystery for science how photosynthesis could have evolved.
Right, and mysteries are what science fills in.
So basically, a science of the gaps or a naturalism of the gaps, right?
No, naturalism of the gaps isn't really a thing.
But you expect that a natural explanation which doesn't require intelligence will be found, right?
Okay, so imagine
Oh, can you answer my question? Do you expect that? That's what you expect, right?
Okay, repeat the question.
You expect that science will find a naturalistic explanation which will not require an intelligence operating to instantiate photosynthesis, right?
I don't think we expect nor not expect that.
I'm asking what you think. What do you believe? Do you believe that science will find an answer and no designer will be required?
I think that's a different question, though.
Okay, so can you answer, please?
Okay, which question do you want me to answer? Because the first question you were asking was science would expect or not expect this, and now you're asking, would I expect or not expect this? So
Yes,
which question am I answering?
Yes, you. What do you expect? Do you believe that science will find an explanation in regards of it?
Sure, but that's not indicative of what science does overall.
Yes, but you believe that science will find a naturalistic explanation, right?
Yes, again, but that's not indicative of how the scientific process works. I am not the scientific process.
You are not the scientific process, but you agree that intelligence would be a possible explanation, right?
It's always a possible explanation.
Okay, so what would you expect in order to say, oh, what we see here is better explained by design?
Well, that would have to be. Let's see. Well, I don't think. Well, in terms of things like biology, for instance, where we have, I don't think that's a settled question because we have mechanisms involved by which they can change. So I don't know if the design aspects we use for archaeology, for instance, would necessarily apply there. So I don't know.
We are not talking about archaeology. We are talking about biochemistry and biology.
Right.
And,
I'm saying I don't know how it would apply.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure.
So you see, in order for you actually to make up your mind in that entire discussion and debate of evolution to versus creationism, you would actually first to understand what the range of possibilities for unguided, non-intelligent mechanisms to instantiate versus what only intelligence can do, and then look into the evidence and then actually compare in order to understand, okay, here we have a feature which it seems evolution or natural mechanisms is capable to explain. Oh, here we have a feature. Wow, here is lots of information. Here is genetic codes. We see here proteins which are not working by themselves. They need to be integrated in the entire process. What does that lead to?
It leads to the fact that we have a mystery to solve.
And you think that there will be a threshold where you will be justifyingly, where you will say justifyingly, okay, this seems to be a feature which only intelligence can explain?
Well, it depends on what kind of intelligence we're talking about.
No,
Are we talking about a supernatural intelligence?
Yeah, just intelligence. It doesn't matter to qualify or to explain the intelligence or its origin. It is only about if you see something in nature which you know this is something which only an intelligent agency is capable to instantiate. Natural, unguided, non-intelligent mechanisms are not capable of instantiating this.
Hey, quick question. Does anybody know who LPP's Unicorns is? Is that actually LPP himself, or is that somebody else?
I'm not sure.
Okay, he says it is him actually. All right.
Well, if you want to come in.
What's up, everybody?
How's it going?
Hey, pretty good. Great debate. Nice to know, TJ.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's always fascinating to me, and I think what's happening between Andrew and Otangelo is, further indication of this. Like, it doesn't matter what level of expanse you go into regarding addressing of concerns, providing evidence, rational arguments, logic, whatever it may be. It's always going to be there's some other explanation. Doesn't matter whether or not you are providing the more plausible, comprehensive argument. There must always be an escape hatch. Therefore, I'm going to ignore everything. I mean, it's all it boils down to.
I'm not doing that. I'm not saying there is another
you do, Andrew. I listened to you for so long already, for over a year, I think. And I don't think you are honestly open-minded to consider the design hypothesis.
Hey, so Otangelo, have you seen the paper that came out this year about how they have just now actually sequenced the entirety of chromosome 8?
No.
This came out April 17th, I believe it was. And so all the bovine scatology we hear ad nauseum from the Evo atheists about how, like, the DNA has been completely sequenced and there is no differentiation. All that standard talking point. Oh, yeah, then if that's the case, then why this year, April of 2021, is there a paper coming out, the entire point of which, we've now actually sequenced chromosome 8, as an example. And then other papers from the same group, going back to like 2017, 2018, where they were actually doing full-scale comparisons of and Otangelo, you've heard me actually raise this question before. It was very fascinating when I found this paper. The point of just because you might have a sequence, is the actual position in the chromosome important and relevant, and is it different between, say, chimps and humans? And guess what? Turns out that now they're doing more comprehensive analysis. It turns out there's dramatic differences in the actual organization, the structural organizations of chromosomes, and where the actually different, the functional components are. Now, there are some similarities, but there's also massive differences.
It's not only that, John, but we are talking also about the spliceosome, which, for example, we humans have 20,000 genes, and there are 300 different ways to splice the gene to have different protein species and products. And we are talking also about, as you are saying now, how actually the information is expressed and the gene regulatory network. And you can have the 98% of similarity between chimps and humans. It doesn't matter, because what makes actually the physical body, there are so many different epigenetic signaling and codes and languages involved, and they play I think, a much greater role than just the genetic information.
Well, you're absolutely right, and I think I've talked about this, and you have, other folks talked about this, but the now realized, documented, and being actively studied reality of like transchromosomal gene regulatory factors and transcription factories, where it's like, hey, the three-dimensional structure, not just of one chromosome and not just the linear locations of genes inside of one chromosome, but their location and proximity and, being in the correct order from a three-dimensional standpoint from multiple chromosomes, like being pulled together, conjoined, and magically having the different transcription components in these specific positions from a three-dimensional space standpoint that are being necessary for eukaryote gene transcription and expression. Like, those kinds of things, to me, they take things to an entirely new level. And it's like, hey, guys, you haven't the Evos have not even accounted for, as you were making the point of, Tangelo, where does the genetic code come from? Like, haven't even accounted for that. And are now being like, oh, no, it's totally reasonable that somehow the three-dimensional locations of technological components, code sequences, et cetera, all just somehow manage to put themselves in the appropriate positions. And we're finding out that things like, if the Tata box sequence drops off a little bit, that equals XYZ fatal condition. So that means that you don't have fitness if you don't have the appropriate repeat sequence. We're not even talking about the code at this point. We're talking about you don't have a specific length of a repeat sequence. You have a non-fit organism. To me, it's like, just get out of here with the bovine scatology talking points if you're not going to address this kind of stuff in terms of what's more rational. It gets me very irritated listening to this crap and claiming it's all explained. It's not.
And I mentioned this, John, at the point 5. Chromatin dance in the nucleus through extensile motors affect transcription and gene regulation. So the 3D location of the chromosomes inside of the nucleus is decisive and expressed when machinery then.
Hey, Tangelo, you're roboting pretty bad.
Well, I don't know what to do about it, so.
You're coming through now.
Okay, so the 3D location of the chromosomes in the nucleus gives information in regards to when something has to be transcribed and expressed. And there are proteins which are literally physically moving around the chromosomes to put them in the right location. And I mean, this is an entire different level of complexity and information. It's basically information on top of information. Several lines of levels of information, all stacked up one above the other. How do you imagine that this evolved, Andrew, by slow processes?
About what specifically? Sorry, I was looking at something else. I apologize.
Yeah, John, if you want to add something.
Oh, I mean, so one of my most recent interests has been in like neuroscience, and so I'm going through a crash course that was specifically designed for med students, and it's pretty fascinating stuff, and been interesting since I understand baseline biological functions and all these different things that we're talking about. Listening to their application in from a neuroscience perspective, and we just contemplate the voltage gradients and the different electric charge sensors that are necessary for sodium, calcium pumps and channels to be executed. The different, the checkpoints and all these different things that are happening. I mean, there's even like reserves. Like there's a little reserve compartment. Like, hey, if you run out, we've got a little fallback position that pops out so that you can continue to function. I mean, it's like, you're telling me that this isn't designed? Really? And folks, this is all 3D printed. And then there's code for not only the functions, but also for the fallback position and the emergency checkpoints and like quality control. And to me, like the more if you actually take the time to go down the proverbial rabbit hole and not just stop at the talking point crap that we hear from the Evos, it's like I can't take you seriously anymore. To be honest, with some of these folks, it's like, you want to tell me that somehow, even though we know that one point mutation causes all X disease and this point mutation causes Y disease, and like we can go down the line, and all these different things cause autism, cause all this kind of stuff, and you're telling me that we can't have basically no errors in all of these arenas without massive negatives, if not fatalities, like major issues. And it's like saying, oh, well, we used to all have Down syndrome, but somehow we overcame that. Really? I please go and make that a public argument. It's nobody would take that seriously. It gets anyway. I yield.
John, in order to have an action potential from a nerve and in a neuron, you need 4 pumps and channels working in a joint venture together. And if they don't work together, you have no action potential and you have no nervous system. So the question, of course, emerges, how did that evolve? Right?
Well, I agree, and that's what your point you're making there. I mean, it goes on in multiple layers. Like, okay, if you don't have all those components working together, how do you have the function? Okay,
Exactly.
well, they don't have an answer for that. And then, like, oh, you have to have dendrites, and you have to have all these different pieces. Oh, well, this one connects to that one. This one connects to that one. And if I don't have this one, then I have nothing. Like, to me, when you start to go into these functions, and then what really cracks me up is they're like, oh, turns out that XYZ function, like what we're talking about now, oh yeah, that was one of the very first things that evolved. And I'm like, hang on. So on one side, you guys make the argument that, oh, over given enough time, this stupidly complicated function could somehow evolve from more simplistic functions. But then per your own freaking timeline, it was one of the first things that evolved. So that entire argument gets tossed out the window, except for uninformed idiots. And you made the point earlier, Tangela, about photosynthesis. That is one of the most complicated functions. Like, there's not much more that's more complicated than photosynthesis. But yet, that was one of the first things that supposedly evolved.
Yeah, and I mean, the ribosome is also something absolute, which you studied as well. We have, right at the beginning of the history of life, some of the most complex protein systems and pathways which require an explanation, and science doesn't have an explanation. And it is not because they have not searched enough. It's precisely because what is being unraveled is layers of complexity above layers of complexity and more complexity. So rather than actually explaining something by natural means, what we are seeing is that it is not possible to explain by natural means.
So real quick, I want to acknowledge Danny, because he just came in. Shalom, Danny. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Real briefly, I do just want to ask, just since they are technically the topics, did you have any comments on either of the two debates or my previous video, or were you coming in for the conversation we're currently having?
Are you talking? I last time I heard you debate, I suppose, was stuff with Rage. Are you including that, or did you really have two debates today?
No, so it's a debate I had with Kenny Rhodes on the Young Earth, Old Earth thing, but strictly from a biblical perspective. And then I had a debate today with Michael, the Canadian atheist. But if you wanted to ask any questions about the discussion I had with Rage, that's perfectly fine as well. And, this is an open topic for sure.
Yeah, I don't have nothing in particular in mind.
For sure.
I think we've already really discussed. I'm not straight when, sexually speaking, I'm like rather deviant, but I just don't really, there are two reasons why I don't really care about Pride Month or Pride. Number one is I was raised conservative, so I just don't have the same, I just don't care. And then the second is I in agreement with you, I just find it to be in support of anti-bullying of a particular sector, but then those sorts of people are fine with, traditionally fine with bullying other people that, I find don't have particularly different features. And so it's just very tribalistic to me. that's another reason why I don't care about it. But but yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, it is interesting how often I do end up agreeing with you on a lot of these issues. I find that kind of interesting, even though we do kind of come to different ultimate conclusions. With that being said, though, just wanted to acknowledge that, of course, and and give it an opportunity to talk about those things.
I have a question for Danny.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
So, Danny, how did you overcome being one of the most hated characters by putting Brain in the gang?
Oh my
And
god!
the other day, you were back on. He was like couple days ago. He was going on a tangent about how many sock accounts he'd banned, and then the next day you were on the panel, and I was like, "What just happened?" So I want to know how did you get back in?
I don't really know. But today I was banned again. So I was in there, and then he said that like I didn't know, I was ignorant about something, and then I said, "Well, are you gonna defend your assertion, or are you gonna just run away like a coward?" And then he said, "Well, I have a one-on-one with you." And then I said, "Why would I have a one-on-one with a dishonest interlocutor? Why would I waste my time?" And then he kicked me out.
So here's what I want to know. Did you actually have 87 sock accounts?
I have a few hundred of them, but there's no way you can't stop me. If you want to get rid of me, it's like I'll be like a kind of pest. So it's hard to get rid of DNA. You can't.
Who are you talking about, Danny?
Speed of sound.
Okay. Oh yeah. I'm not there for several weeks already, so.
Danny,
I mean, I miss some of the people there. I like some of the, even like, there's like that Midnight guy who hates me, but I don't even mind him. I don't even mind Speed that much. It's just when he talks about, most of what comes out of his mouth is just like kind of crazy to me. But any science that he talks about, I'm not, I'm not an expert to know whether it's making sense or not. So, but any other sort of like almost wrong 100% of the time. But
I'd say one of the funniest things that I have observed from them was, I don't know, this was maybe last week. It's like how genes function or something, weather report. And what was cracking me up is multiple of the biggest trash talkers that are there almost every day were admitting they didn't understand how protein synthesis works.
Who was it that admitted
I think it was like David, maybe. I don't know. One of the guys that's always on there. I forget.
Oh, Lori has absolutely no clue about anything, basically. So.
Yeah, I forget. But they admitted they didn't understand even the basics of protein synthesis. They didn't understand DNA, mRNA. They didn't get it at all. And I'm like, okay. So these are the same clowns who run around claiming that Otangelo, myself, anybody else, doesn't know what we're talking about, that we're ignorant. And we just buy into, this creationist ID stuff because we believe in God of the gaps and whatnot, while simultaneously admitting they don't know what the hell protein synthesis is. Yeah. At that point, any and all credibility of your accusations towards me or anybody else has flown the coop, and you need to be installed in the coop because you're a uninformed idiot who needs to keep your mouth shut, in my opinion.
No, the problem, John, is not that science doesn't know how it works. The problem is that science doesn't have a clue how it can be, how it was instantiated. That's the crux of the problem.
No, I agree with you. I'm saying that these people who are accusing us of not knowing what's happening while admitting that they don't have a clue, like I'm talking about themselves individually, they don't even understand the concepts, but are accusing us of not knowing what we're talking about and making a conclusion. And I'm like, okay, if you don't understand the process, how are you even remotely qualified to have any kind of opinion on whether or not I can perform a critical analysis on what the underlying necessities would be? If you don't even know what the necessities are, I mean, by default, you're an ignorant fool at that point if you're running around claiming the other person doesn't know what they're talking about. Like, I've made this point many times. In no other context would somebody make that argument.
But John, what I've seen, they accusing you that you don't have the guts to go actually into the streams and defend your position.
Oh, I mean, I categorically false. I've been in there multiple times, and usually they talk over me, mute me, or put you backstage in the middle of a sentence. And when you actually start to annihilate their positions, you get muted or kicked. So it's
That happened at
it's a
Speech
waste of
Channel?
time.
That happened at Speech Channel? At Speech
Oh, yeah.
Channel that happened?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Usually the only time I go in there now is when they make false. They like literally lie about me, and I go in, call them out, and they admit like, oh yeah, well maybe we didn't actually know what we're talking about.
I mean, honestly, John, I mean, this is going on about a year or so. I think it is a year that I started actually to join YouTube streams. And I've been many times at the Speech Channel. And I mean, you can provide whatever kind of evidence that you want, but they simply will not acknowledge anything in regards of how we see it. So, I mean, the question is, what point does it make still to go there? You know, we know that they will not accept whatever we say.
Well, in the case of true atheism, it's I believe it's the case that they've already made up their mind that they don't want to acknowledge any kind of existence in which there is a supreme deity.
Yeah, exactly.
And
So
so
real
many
briefly,
of them.
sorry, just got to cut in here real quick,
No,
just
it's
because I
okay.
do want to allow Andrew to ask a question. He said that he had another question. I don't want to get too far off before we forget about it and all that. So Andrew, go ahead and ask a question real quick, and we'll see where this ends up leading us as well.
Okay. Also, does anyone know if Mindben is back yet, or does anyone know where he went? He was off for a while.
I've been back.
Oh,
I guess
okay.
you can, yeah.
Sorry, just making sure.
I just haven't
So-
said anything.
Oh, what was that?
Oh, I wanted to tell you, LPP. Did you hear Speed's assessment of T-Jump versus me? Did you hear why he thought I lost the debate by any chance?
Then you cannot lose against T-Chomp. You cannot lose. Nobody can lose against T-Chomp. Sorry.
Whether you win it, I'm not interested in whether I won or lost, but what I was interested in is the reason why he thought I lost. He said because T-Jump's facial expression showed that I didn't make sense. That was his reason.
Hang on, that's what Pudding Brain said is why T-Jump won?
Yeah, I have the recording. But that's literally what he said.
Well, you know, these are the same clowns who said that the hoodie-wearing guy who calls himself atheist or actual socialist trash beat me. So, I mean, we can take all this stuff with a grain of salt.
Should I ask my question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I guess this is going back to what I was saying about common ancestry and such. Have you, or CJ, have you heard of the term or use of the term nested hierarchy in biology by any chance?
You say nested hierarchy?
Yeah, like nested Russian dolls, but in this case for groups within groups, basically going back to phylogenetics.
I don't think so.
Okay. Kind of like how, well, the best way I've heard it described is basically, like I said, groups within groups, kind of like how primates are mammals and mammals are amniotes and amniotes are vertebrates, etc.
Oh, yeah, I know. Okay, I get what you're. So, like, in other words, things don't ever evolve out of their particular thing; they just evolve into a subsect of that thing, right?
Yeah, that would be a good way to describe it. Yeah, I wanted to hear your thoughts on that because sometimes I hear that the nested hierarchy is not evidence for common ancestry, but rather evidence of kind of a common creator or designer or things like that. And I want to hear your thoughts on that because to me at least, a nested hierarchy that can be basically not categorized, kind of defined by certain traits. So like, for instance, like you probably already know this, that like you can define these groups by certain traits, like vertebrates, obviously vertebrae, and amniotes, the amnion, and obviously also genetic traits, the DNA sequences. But what do you think about that in terms of common ancestry and common design and things like that overall?
Well, I have to say a couple things. The first one, it's another one that I'd want to specify. I wouldn't be like super expertise on. That wasn't a properly grammatical sentence, but whatever.
Yeah, that's okay.
But with that said, there are a couple things just from a layman's perspective that I certainly have like some questions about. So like, for example, atheists, well, I'll be more specific about that. Evolutionists will typically say that there is what they call convergent evolution, as well as separate ancestry. But it's like, for example, they'll say like we have ancestry from the Neanderthals from a certain area, and then ancestry from some other group of people I can't remember, but from Australia. Starts with a D, I believe. And so on and so forth. Yeah, I think that is exactly what it is.
I think weren't those actually in like Siberia? I think closer to Neanderthals. That's what I've heard.
Hey Andrew, did you see the report that came out that had Neanderthals, Denisovans, modern humans, and I forget one other one, all living in the same area and interbreeding at the same time?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's been known for a while.
Okay, so which one came first then?
Well,
personally, I just got to say, I think that that's evidence that they're all human beings. I don't know what you would say about that, Andrew, but I think that, and I think LPP, you probably agree with me. I think that's evidence that they were all human and not actually like some lesser or more evolved or anything like that version of human. But actually,
right, yeah. I mean, I kind of feel it's similar to how polar bears and grizzly bears, for instance, can interbreed. It kind of like how closely related species that have it kind of depends, because sometimes even distant species can, but for the most part, hybridization occurs between closely related species that have technically speciated but aren't too different. So yeah, I think they would be inhuman in a sense, but I don't think they'd still be the same species of human necessarily.
Well, I think so. That's actually a kind of a good thing to bring up, actually, because that'll help a little bit with what I was just going to say.
Okay.
Because the reason I brought up these sort of divergent evolutionary things, as well as separate ancestry for certain species, is that it seems like those kinds of things contradict other sorts of things that evolutionists will want to argue. Like, for example, if we have these different species coming at these different times, and then they're somehow breeding with each other to create these other species, and in this case you have like the Neanderthals and Devosians and all that, right? That seems to fly in the face of this idea that you only see this eukaryote or vertebrate or whatever it happens to be one time, and then everybody sits in this sort of successive system outside of it. It's like, it almost seems like, to me at least as a layman, like you should only be able to have one or the other.
Andrew, your argument breaks down immediately in regards of the three domains of life, because bacteria and archaea and eukaryotes are completely different, and you cannot apply the nested hierarchy argument in regards of those.
Well, in terms of the three domains of life, of course not, because there's nothing they fall in. There's not a larger set they fall into besides, life.
So your argument breaks down, because we know that there are several things which are completely different, and that breaks down common ancestry. That is simply a claim which is not true. So in rather than explaining one kind of origin of life, you have to explain at least two. How do you do that?
Well, real briefly, I do want to say, just to finish my sort of point here, and I think it adds just a little bit of context to this. you know, it is interesting. Like we'll say, well, like polar bears and brown bears can interbreed, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that when they interbreed, it's even something that can have viable offspring itself.
I think so. Yeah.
Which is, of course, a big deal, right? Because like a liger, for example, will not have viable ice cream. Sorry.
Yeah.
Offspring. Anyways.
They have common ancestor. What's the point? That's microevolution.
And my point is kind of that I think it almost seems to me like that proves that the current understanding of the word species is flawed. And that really the evolutionist doesn't really have a solid idea of what is, because the definition of species is interbreeding populations that can produce viable offspring. That would make brown bears and polar bears the same species.
Right. That's sorry, just a button. So that is what's called a species concept. It's specifically the biological species concept. So when you're applying or trying to define species in different areas, bacteria, for instance, like you can't really define bacteria using that species concept.
Do you know how many concepts there are? Andrew?
Oh, there are a bunch.
26.
Yep, that sounds about right. And the reason, I would just say the reason there are so many species concepts is because some kind of evolution is taking place, in that the boundaries are becoming fuzzier and fuzzier as time progresses. And so it kind of depends what region or what discipline you're looking at in order to define species. So like, for instance, animals and plants, biological species concept works most of the time. Bacteria, you got to use like a genetic or phylogenetic species concept, for instance. Does that kind of put a little bit into it, CJ?
Well, I think to an extent, but I still think I would see a little bit of a problem, just only because when we do get to not even just animals, but mammals, which are supposed to be, if I understand correctly, the most complex on the chain, although I think birds might also qualify for incredibly complex. It doesn't seem to me like the biological definition of evolution does work, because, you know, like I said, if we have now, I could see how, you know, a lion and a tiger can reproduce, but their own child can't reproduce, even if it's with another lion or a tiger, let alone with a liger or a tigon, right?
Sure.
And that to me would seem like, you know, it shows a clear example of degradation in the ability of these two animals to mate with each other, but also some level of common ancestry, because they obviously could have in the past when they were more similar. And then you have these animals like bears. The way bears operate is no different than the way that dogs operate in that particular regard, right? The brown bear and the polar bear will produce offspring. That offspring can produce offspring with one of its own kind ad infinitum. And really, if ever something occurs where they end up being in the same population for a long period of time, we'll have another quote unquote species of bear, which is very likely to occur. I mean, that's actually something that happens frequently in zoological history, right?
Right.
So how is it then that we can apply the biological definition of species to these different species of bears when the way they're operating is the same way we would expect, for example, Canis lupus to operate, right? Where, yeah, you can have a golden retriever mate with a Eurasian wolf, but they're actually both gray wolves when you actually break it down.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it does, like I said, get a bit fuzzy. I think, like, it's not just that they can interbreed, but like you said, that they can produce viable, fertile offspring. But even then, it breaks down because there are probably, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but there are always exceptions, of course. I feel like, did you mention something about, sorry if this is changing the topic, but did you mention something about convergent evolution earlier?
Yeah, I think I used the wrong word. I said divergent, which doesn't make any sense at all. But yeah, that's what I was talking about is convergent. Obviously, divergent is the exact opposite. So my apologies for that.
Oh, that's okay.
Sinocock, I'm leaving. Have a good night. Thank you for having me at your
See you,
channel.
Tangelo.
Okay.
Thanks for joining.
Stay the Smokey in the same room.
Yeah, and shalom, Angela. You have a good rest of your night as well. And yeah, so go on with what you were going to say then, and then also I want to acknowledge Smokey.
Yeah, you can address Smokey, and then I'll continue.
Cool. Thanks for having me. That's all. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Okay. So a question I like to bring up, and maybe you can add something to this, but basically, kind of, to me at least, convergence seems to happen where it shouldn't necessarily happen under common design, for instance. So, for example, when you well, the example I like to use is, for instance, when you go into the deeper morphology and anatomy, we are actually closer in structure and in terms of evolution, we would say closer and related to tuna than tuna are to sharks, despite the fact that tuna and sharks live in the same environment. And sometimes I hear the response that God designed them that way because he could, but to me at least that doesn't seem like a very testable or really explains anything kind of explanation. So did you want to add anything on to that?
Well, so I think that would be kind of an interesting example as to, once again, something that I think is kind of a flaw about the evolutionary model. And actually, I think there's an even better example than that, which is that, did you know, by chromosomal similarity, we're actually more similar to chimpanzees than tigers are to lions, which
Right.
That sounds like it's an argument for common ancestry. But if you actually break it down, we know that lions and I didn't even notice LPP left. Anyways, we know that lions and tigers can interbreed. And obviously they don't bring viable offspring, but that does indicate at some level that they had, some level of common ancestry. And yet there has been, at least if I understand correctly, I may be misunderstanding here, but I believe that this has been brought up in a few Kent Hovind debates, against him. People have actually tried to have scientific experiments where they try to mix chimpanzee and human DNA. It doesn't work. Now, obviously, that's kind of a repulsive thing to even think of, but nonetheless, it is, if I understand correctly, I do think that people have tried it, and some people have even argued, well, we got the embryo to attach for like a couple hours, and as if that were some kind of an argument for evolution. But like I said, if you're actually looking at it, what it actually shows is chromosomal similarity doesn't actually mean anything, because we know that lions and tigers are more related to each other than we are to chimpanzees, even though it appears there is more of a chromosomal similarity between us and chimpanzees.
Right, and I see what you're saying. My only concern would be the fact that, and I'm not trying to down you on this, but like in phylogenetics, at least, chromosomal differences and similarities aren't really as important. It like the common thing that I think Kent Hovind brings up, at least, is that like octopus and ink pens, for instance, are certain percentage of water, therefore they're related or something like that. And that's obviously nonsense. The way I understand it is basically not that you're looking at the chromosomes as a whole, but rather that you're kind of thinking of each individual DNA nucleotide, so each base pair, as kind of its own character or trait, in the sense of putting it into the matrix and coming up with your tree, in the same way that you would consider this specific kind of limb or feathers or things like that. So it kind of, to me at least, chromosomal similarities aren't really as applicable as a character trait in phylogenetics because of the fact that they can vary so much. And I mean, even then, you can have traits with what's called a low signal. So, like, for instance, you can have color, for instance, and obviously we don't judge or not judge. We don't categorize creatures or group them by color, for instance. Otherwise, you would have robins closer to foxes or specific kinds of foxes, for instance, because those traits can vary so much and they can vary irrespective of their relationships. I don't know. Sorry, I'm not trying to rant here.
No, you're totally fine. And I even have a level of agreement with that. But it is important to note, the reason why things like DNA and chromosomal similarity were brought up, not even just by myself, but like people like Ken Hovind and stuff like that in the 90s and early 2000s, was because that was one of the primary arguments people would use to say, see, we're obviously related to chimpanzees, and it turned out that just doesn't work, right? It breaks down. And right. To be fair, I do acknowledge that there are a good number of evolutionists who now are turning away from that idea, though I don't necessarily know any of their new ideas, because, as I said, this isn't something that's like a serious area of interest for me.
Just to clarify, are you talking about like 98% similarity and those kinds of claims in DNA, basically?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So if I can, so this kind of gets into a common misconception about phylogenetics, and I'm not saying you have it or anything or anyone else here, but like some people say, for instance, that this goes back to the octopus and ink pen, for instance, but like basically that's not exactly how phylogenetics works. So kind of phylogenetics is a method of comparison that I like to say involves threes, not twos. So, for example, if you compare two organisms and say they're X% similar, that doesn't really tell you anything about relatedness. But if you say, for instance, they're X% similar and that X similarity is, or that percentage is greater between them than between them and, say, a third species, then you know that those two original species are more closely related in comparison to that third species. And that's kind of more how the phylogenetic methodology works. Does that kind of make sense?
It definitely does, but I think that it still does kind of run into the same problem, though. And again, I'm not an expert in this, but it just seems to me like, in order for that to actually mean something in regards to, proving some level of not even just similarity, but relation, it couldn't be true that we shared more similarity or relation to apes than cats do to each other, because cats show the biological qualifications of a species and we don't, as far as with the apes. And I just, that seems to me like it's a pretty big deal, you know what I mean? Because like we do, of course, not even just talking about the tigers and lions, but mules, at least once every, I think it's like 2,200 or something like that. It's a pretty large minority, but sometimes mules can actually reproduce with other mules. It's like a fluke, but it does happen. And the number may be more or less than I actually just said, because of course, like I said, I'm not, super into this kind of stuff, but the point just kind of being that, that's another one where they are supposed to be less similar with each other and also with zebras than we are with apes, but that there's no way that can be true, because they can produce offspring that are even occasionally viable and we just can't, right?
That I would personally have to look into it more, because that doesn't make sense to me either. I think the only way I can respond at this point would be just to say that like I said, or what I was saying earlier, plus the fact that sometimes there are exceptions. There are lots of there's basically a lot of variation and what's a good word for it? Can someone come up with like a synonym for like messiness and complexity and all that, like just in nature overall? So, but yeah, I would have to look into it more.
One, to be fair, that's definitely a fair point. I could be totally ignorant. I freely acknowledge that I'm not super into science, and the only areas of science I am really into are paleontology and zoology, which are both specifically animal related. So I could totally be speaking ignorantly at the moment, but it's just things that I observe and have questions of. You know what I mean?
I guess if you want, I can kind of switch it more to something you might be more familiar with. Would you? I guess something that was brought up earlier was this naturalism of the gaps idea. Do you think that's a valid argument?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, and I think it's important to note that's a philosophical argument. And I've actually had some conversations with some pretty philosophically astute atheists and agnostics. And it's interesting. We can't actually have a conversation about naturalism of the gaps because we agree. It very clearly exists. And what we mean by naturalism of the gaps is one thing that needs to be understood is not only the history, but also the claim. The history is, of course, people started claiming God of the gaps was something that creationists and people who believe in religion in general would rely upon, right? Saying basically, we come to a point where we don't know, and whatever it happens to be, we'll just call it X, right? We don't know X, but we believe that God takes care of X, and therefore you have a God of the gaps, right? And if my understanding is correct, it actually comes originally from James Tour, who ironically is not actually a philosopher. But he points out that, well, if that's the criticism you're going to lay against people, you have the self-same problem, which is we don't know what accounts for X, but we believe it is naturalism, and therefore that would be naturalism of the gaps. Now, the reason it's important to point that out is because, number one, you're actually using the self-same logic. A perfect way to show that is just by removing the actual subjects and replacing them with the letters, right? So we don't know how X happens, but we believe Y will account for it, therefore Y of the gaps, right? And that ends up working both with naturalism and with supernaturalism. The other reason it's important to point out is because it actually isn't a logical fallacy. It's something that a lot of atheists and agnostics believe is a logical fallacy. And James Tour's point was to point out that not only is it not a logical fallacy, but if you believe it is, you're committing the self-same one. And I think my favorite example of this being shown with another philosophically astute atheist was actually when I went over onto the Raging Atheist channel probably about 6 or 7 months ago at this point. And Leo Filius and John Peterson and the Raging Atheist and like 6 other people. I mean, obviously that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but there was tons of people there, and they all line up and they're like, all right, we can't wait for this. We're going to have this whole thing completely obliterated and have CJ educated on philosophy because we have our good friend Sock Account here, who I guess they have a lot of confidence in philosophically, and he seems to be relatively astute, but nonetheless. And I laid out, of course, the naturalism of the gaps thing, and what he said is, are you guys ready for this? I agree. And then we moved on because there's just nothing to talk about, right? Like it's clearly a criticism that can be laid against both the theist and the atheist. The response that you could give if you want to be consistent at that point would be, yes, but I believe naturalism is more likely because X, Y, and Z than supernaturalism, and therefore I believe that my naturalism of the gaps is more justified than your God of the gaps. But that's, of course, a different argument. At that point, you're doing nothing more than arguing God versus naturalism, and there's no use to even use the of the gaps criterion, right? And that's the whole point of the criticism naturalism of the gaps, is to show that it's a futile argument. It doesn't actually mean anything.
So maybe I could provide a hypothetical example, and I think I actually gave this one to Mindbend, the YouTube chat, but I'd like to hear and see if what you think about this, and if you think it's naturalism of the gaps per se. So the hypothetical situation would be, say, for instance, a church hospital is trying to heal some amputees, and they go through the process and they anoint the person's wound and put some oil on it, for instance, and then pray to God and then wait. And say, for instance, it works, for instance, and the people go. Oh, never mind. Sorry, I thought I was roboting for a second. And scientists go back and find that, yeah, the we can take out all these other things, but the prayer must be said either way. And to me, at least, I don't think we could go farther than that, because the evidence, for instance, some would say that indicates that God exists and is hearing the prayers. And I guess that may or may not be true, but the evidence can't go beyond the fact that the process works and that this is how it works. And I feel like, I guess, what would be your initial response to that? And do you think that would still be naturalism of the gaps in that case?
I do think it would, but to be honest, I think it might even be a little worse than just a naturalism of the gaps. And so the reason I would say that is because if it were strictly a naturalism of the gaps, then basically what it would be is we have some sort of an unexplainable phenomenon, but I have confidence that it will be explained by virtue of naturalism or some naturalistic process. And that it's not that doesn't apply to your example, but in your example, you're actually actively going against evidence to the contrary, which I think is a little bit greater than just a naturalism of the gap. So, like, for example, if I were to, and this is going to be a reductio ad absurdum, but it'll illustrate the point. Okay. If I were to pray for pancakes to Zeus, right, or the Bigfoot god or whatever, we'll just call it the Bigfoot god to make this a little funnier. And every single time I prayed to the Bigfoot god for pancakes, I got these pancakes manifested magically in front of me. And there was a scripture I could go back, in the Sasquatchium or whatever, and it said that, Sasquatchium verse 3, or chapter 3, verse 32 or whatever it happens to be, I don't know. If you pray to the Sasquatch god or the Bigfoot god or whatever for your pancakes, you will get it every time. And that actually occurred, right? You could say, okay, I have confidence that this will be explained by some naturalistic means. But there's actually active evidence to the contrary, namely active evidence that there is indeed a Bigfoot god and that he actually will give you these pancakes if you pray to him, right? Now, of course, that's a tongue-in-cheek, humorous, absurd, all that other kind of stuff example. But it does have very real applications, not only when you have things like faith healings and stuff like that, but when you're addressing things like theology and Kalam cosmological argument and stuff of that nature. Because you can say, yeah, I'd want to hold out for a naturalistic explanation, but if there are actually active arguments to the contrary, and those arguments are philosophically and logically sound, then at that point, I think you're going into a little bit, which I don't necessarily have a problem with, by the way. You're going a little bit more into a realm that is kind of faith-based, really, right? Which is fine. I have faith in my particular ideology. But at that point, you really are making a claim that despite what appears to be the case, I think that this ideology, this creed, whatever it happens to be, is still true, and you'll have your various reasons for that.
So to me, at least, it seems like my personal philosophy is basically, if the evidence doesn't suggest something, or if basically to not go beyond the evidence, what the evidence suggests. So, like, if we have a claim, for instance, and the evidence neither confirms nor denies that claim, it seems like the claim is kind of irrelevant to that evidence, for lack of a better word. So I can kind of see what you're saying about the scripture and things like that. For instance, I guess sorry, I'm just trying to think at the same time. Yeah, I see what you're saying. I just sometimes, for example, situations of lack of data, for instance, like we would both agree that if you have a lack of data or a lack of knowledge, for instance, that you can't really go beyond I don't know, for instance, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And even I'll even to kind of steelman that point, I'll even say things can appear completely illogical because of lack of data.
Right. Right. And I mean, like going back to the hospital case, it would seem to be like it would make me suspicious, for instance, and I feel like it would cause me to doubt certain things. But I feel like just the fact that the prayers work in this case by itself would not be evidence that specifically something supernatural is going on. I think we would need more evidence than that. I don't know if that's sound reasoning, though.
Here, I have a question for CJ. CJ, how do you distinguish an intentional explanation and a non-natural explanation?
So let me make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. Are you saying, like, how would I distinguish a supernatural explanation from a natural explanation? Is that what you mean?
No. How would you distinguish a supernatural or non-natural explanation and an intentional explanation?
Intentional meaning that somebody had some intent to do it, right?
Right, like desire or
Yeah.
Belief.
Okay. Well, it would have to, I think, be based on probably some sort of a outside piece of evidence that suggests that the thing is supernatural. Like, so for example, in that the pancake example, and also in that prayer example as well, you have prayer to a specific deity, and that prayer to that deity is seemingly what is operating in the healing and in the giving of the pancakes, right? Deities are supernatural, so therefore it would stand to reason that this would be a supernatural thing. Does that make sense?
Not really. I mean, I'm trying. Can you just define for me what a non-natural explanation or non-natural cause would be?
Well, really, it's just any sort of a thing that would defy, I guess, our understandings of physics in a way that cannot be actually rectified by further information that is purely naturalistic.
Do you think beliefs and desires are operate under the laws of physics?
Well, I think it's kind of a category error in a way, because I don't think that the laws of physics necessarily apply to things like our intangible thoughts.
Right, and I'm in agreement, which is why there's a kind of a I don't want to say a problem, but the idea is that I can't really differentiate between a non-natural explanation and just an intentional explanation.
Well, so I think one thing that I would want to ask, just to clarify, is if you could find a repeatable, demonstratable example of what people would typically consider supernatural, like ghosts or answered prayer or healing or whatever, would that make it classify as natural to you, or would you be open to the possibility?
Well, that's just the thing. Like, take a ghost, for example. Like, people claim that they see ghosts, right? But presumably they're seeing something in which is sensitive to photons and reflection, and the idea is that there's still kind of laws about those sort of perceptions in order to establish that there is a ghost, right? So I don't think that, this is just to say that I don't think that appealing to examples is really going to help. And another reason that might motivate this this kind of thinking is, think of like worlds in which people attribute non-natural explanations like magical causes, and like Harry Potter. The idea is that in worlds like Harry Potter, there are still laws and about how the quote-unquote magic is used, right? You have to perform a ritual in a certain kind of way. And the idea is that I just don't see why in the Harry Potter world, right, all the potions class and the defense against the dark arts, all of this is actually not just a part of science, right? It's just a kind of science that we're unfamiliar with, and we just call it, you know, magical or non-natural. But I can't picture why it would be supernatural. But it would only be supernatural in the sense that it's science unlike ours, right? So there's like a problem there. But the idea for me is that I just take, when we're thinking about a non-natural explanation, I just immediately think intentional explanation.
So,
Well, I think,
oh, sorry.
that's all right. I was just going to say, I do think that there is a really good way to look at, I think, the difference between the two in the example you even gave, right? So if you have some kind of a, hard magic system in your fiction, then that hard magic system is obviously going to be, by definition, that's why it's hard magic, part of the codified rules of your world. I think a quintessential example for kids of my generation would be Avatar: The Last Airbender, but Harry Potter is also a very good one, where there is a system of rules, and if you follow this system of rules, almost as if you were following a discipline, you get these quote-unquote magical powers. But there is a difference between something like that and something that you might consider to be maybe even a better word than supernatural would be extra universal, right? In that, like, if a author were to break the fourth wall into his story, that's like him entering in from a dimension that is different and going into this lower dimension in a sort of crude manner of speaking. So, like, for example, in the case of the supernatural, if it was legitimately to be supernatural and not actually just some part of the established rules of our universe, I think that's what it would have to be, is something that is extra or super universal. Meaning that it is coming from without our realm, if you will, right? And so, for example, if you're a Platonist, that would include Platonic objects. If you are somebody who believes in deities, then that would, of course, be the deities. It's not necessarily that you couldn't have some sort of rules around them per se. It's more that they seem to be, I don't know, just like I said, extra universal.
But that's like go ahead, Andrew.
So to me, at least, that seems kind of like dependent on our current state of affairs, because, for instance, we could, and maybe I'm understanding you incorrectly, but like, we could say the same thing about germs, for instance, and how we didn't even know they existed. So something that's beyond our senses could, I don't know, in some sense, be considered extra universal. So I feel,
I kind of agree with Andrew here in the sense that, like, if I went back in time and I told him that there's this germ world that you can't see, right? That kind of explains all these phenomena like illness. They might call it magic, right? Now, obviously, it's not, and it's not in virtue of it. Those sorts of things being governed by laws, right? And I think, you see, that's my criteria for how I differentiate between a natural thing and a non-natural thing, right? Is that a natural thing has regularity with respect to its behavior, right? And that's why, if you really think about it, the Harry Potter world, or the Last Airbender, Tai Chi tricks that they do to perform their bending skills, is just a realm like germs. It's analogous to the germ case, right? We don't know anything about it, right? And we use the term magic or superpower or whatever in order to differentiate it from the sort of things that behave in a regular way here in the actual world, right? But if you think about it, there's not really a principal difference if it's the case that those things operate in a regular law-like fashion, right? And I just, so that's what I take. I take your example, CJ, to be good. Of a Platonist is going to think that abstract objects exist, and the reason why those are not natural is because those don't even engage in causal relations. They are not the cause of anything, nor are they the effect of anything. So there are no laws of behavior with respect to the number 3 and such, right? Same with intentional explanations. I think that when I want something, there's no entailment about what I should see in the world, right? There's like this distinction between a thing in the world and a perspective of the world. That, I think, is a real dichotomy, where an unbreachable dichotomy between mind and world, right? Which is one of the reasons why I'm a dualist. But the idea, I just take, if there is a non-natural event, right? It seems like it's just going to be an event in which there's someone intended to do something.
I kind of agree with where Danny's going. Danny, can I present an idea to you, because it came up during a debate with T-Jump, and I was challenging him about the idea of atheists having a burden of proof, and I had asked him about some sort of, idea of what would be an idea of something that would help him verify or give some sort of, credit or evidence to the existence of a God, and he used the gold brick analogy. Have you heard him use that one before?
No, I tried. Well, I'm going to be nice. Yeah, I have not heard it.
Okay, sure. Yeah, it's basically along the lines of like, well, this is T-Jump speaking, of course, saying, well, I would believe there is a God if I prayed for a gold brick, and every time I prayed for a gold brick, one showed up. And my argument was, well, at that point, how would you, T-Jump, differentiate between that being the evidence of the existence of God or the discovery of a new natural phenomenon that every time you say these words, a brick pops up?
Oh my gosh, you just asked the $1 million question, right? And this is one of the reasons why I'm unpopular amongst not only atheists, but as well as theists, right? So I think that if you think about your question, what this might suggest is that there can't be evidence for or against God, right? Because the idea is that if you pray for a gold brick, you see, look, let me be honest here. If I prayed for a gold brick in the name of Jesus and it appeared before me, I would be a Christian. Let's just get that out of the way.
Okay.
But who cares, right? I'm just talking about cause effect there. We want to ask why.
But that's a perspective component where T-Jump or someone else, or even Dillahuntee, say for instance, could do the same thing and be like, oh, isn't this neat new naturalism phenomenon that we just
right?
Like they can choose how to interpret it.
Exactly. And so I'm of the view that now this is going to sound crazy, but because of your question, I think I go as far as to say that people that saw, if let's say Jesus existed, that people that saw Jesus resurrect, people that saw him walk on water and perform all these miracles, those that believed, imagine a skeptic, maybe the 13th, disciple, right, who left, right? Is like, yeah, I see all these things, but I think it's just the laws of, it's nature in a way that we haven't seen it or something like that. And he just walks away. I would, as one of the disciples of Christ, right, I would have I would not know how to respond to such a person. I would just shrug my shoulders and just kind of I don't know what I would say to him. Right.
Danny, if I could, maybe to take it to the next level. What I might argue, and let me know how you feel about this. If you prayed for a gold brick and got it every single time, it would look like a naturalistic, non-intentional phenomenon, or could look like that. Or it could look like a supernatural, non-intentional phenomenon. Yeah. As it, no real mind behind it. It's just these things are said, and there's an automatic occurrence. There's a causal, action inside the physical universe that has a causal reaction to it. There's no mind. There's no reason to draw a mind behind it at all. However, if you pray and only sometimes get it, that might insinuate that there might be an agent of mind behind the action. How do you feel about that?
Oh, well, I'm incredulous about it, but there's something I'm going to explain why, maybe in these terms. It's that. Oh, 1 second. My wife is where. Okay. Well, let me answer this question, then we'll go. Okay. I told her we'd go.
She will pull you away from losing, Daddy. Uh-oh.
She's hungry, and when she's hungry, she's
Oh, she gets hangry. Yeah,
yeah,
no,
you
I know
get
what
hangry.
that's like. I
You
get
say
it.
hi. Say hi, Bing. So
I'm not hungry. I'm hungry.
Hello, madam.
okay, but very briefly, I lost my train of thought. What the question?
It's okay. Yeah, no, I'll repackage it. So
Yeah.
if you were praying and you got it every single time, that would be an indication of a non-mind component behind it. If you prayed for it and only got it some of the time, it might be evidence of an actual mind component, an intentional component behind it.
Yeah, I mean, okay, but then there's so you're saying that in virtue of it not being, if it's less regular, it's less likely to be of nature, is what you're trying. I think that's
You're right. That
right.
was kind of trying where I'm drawing to.
Yeah, but there are all sorts of things that, like, volcanoes are not very regular. Earthquakes are not very regular. The principle is kind of tricky there. But I think before I have to go, I'll say this, that I don't think that, okay, if I were a Christian, if I were to, this is how I would respond. I would be an externalist about this. That's to say that there is no justification that I could provide for someone about knowing that God intervened in the world, but I am justified in a way that I'm not really, I'm justified in a way where that justification is not accessible to me, right? And I think that this is what some of the Reformed epistemologists do, like Alvin Plantinga and others, right? They want to say that the way that you're justified in God belief is doesn't always come down to like your inferences, right? Or your principles that you hold about how the world works, or your metaphysics, that God sets you up in a way where, given that, you're justified and you don't have to be privy to it. Okay? That would be my answer. That would be Christian Danny's answer. But I think there are a lot of to be an externalist, then you're going to be susceptible to criticisms against externalism. But that's another chapter in the conversation. That's how I would respond, Darth. I mean,
Sure.
Darth. I just called you Darth.
Darth, you can call me Darth for today. That's okay.
Well, and I would have to bring up again, though.
I really appreciate that response, Danny. Thank you for that.
Okay, see y'all.
Danny.
Yeah, have a good rest of your day. And I would just say just one last thing on this.
Yeah, I'm
topic.
listening.
Well, you can certainly leave. I'm only going to repeat myself. So, but I just think that. Yeah.
Okay. Bye.
Yeah, have a good rest of your day, man. I just think that's the other world. Why I think that otherworldly or super universal, I even think is a better word. Is a better word to describe what would actually be a supernatural thing, because regularity or non-regularity could happen and a thing could still be supernatural, in my opinion, and that's why I would give the example that, like I said, I already gave. I'm just repeating myself. But of like, you can have something that appears magical, like people bending the elements in Avatar, but is actually an established part of the universe. But then you could also have something that is literally one greater universe, if you will, or realm of existence, namely that of the author, breaking into that lesser universe or realm of existence, namely that of the creation. And that's like when people break the fourth wall, right? That's clearly an example of something from a greater realm of existence going into a lesser realm of existence, in a sense, of course, because fiction is obviously fiction.
Right.
But it's like the closest that we can get to seeing that, I think, from our perspective.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I was just gonna say, when you're done, if you wouldn't mind, CJ, I would like to actually ask Smokey some series of questions, see if we're kind of thinking along the same lines, because I kind of agreed with Danny on some points but disagreed on others. So if that's okay with you, of course.
Yeah, I would just briefly finish what I was saying just by saying that in the like bacteria example that was given, right? Well, bacteria, much like bending or magic or whatever in these different fictional universes, is just something that is in the end operating as a part of our physical existence, whereas a angel, demon, or God actually manifesting themselves in our existence would be much more akin to that fourth wall breaking of something from a greater realm of existence actually bringing itself down to our lesser realm of existence.
Right. Yeah, and I'll be happy to hear Andrew's stuff. If I could just preface whatever you're about to say or ask, Andrew, I would say to think about how I'm looking at this in terms of a pathway of justification of intentional supernatural over unguided naturalistic would be a scope, a series of ranges of probabilities based upon like what is this thing that we are seeing, observing, or describing, and what type of verification criteria is reasonable to subject it to. But with that, I'll go ahead and hear anything you want to ask or elaborate on.
Yeah. So, am I?
I just want to make sure it's not going along the lines of, oh, what is proof of? So, and I don't think you were going down that way.
No.
Preface that. So, yeah. Okay, go ahead.
So we would kind of. Oh, I'm hearing some echoing from somewhere.
It might be me.
Okay. Okay. So basically, we would both agree that science, speaking scientifically, that science has some fundamental axioms, and to me, at least, two of those axioms are the two main ones. Seem to be that there is that whatever fundamental reality there is, that reality can be investigated empirically, and that the empirical clues we gain from that investigation can be understood, correct?
Well, there's some things that can't be investigated empirically and can only be investigated abstractly. So for instance, something like dark matter or dark energy, only when you extrapolate through cosmological mathematics do you realize that in order for our universe to maintain its geometrically flat shape, it would require a certain metric of matter and a certain metric of energy, of which portions of which we haven't been able to detect through the other standard methods of energy detection and matter detection, therefore labeled dark energy, not because they're indeed dark, but of the idea of our understanding of them is.
Right. Or we would still, in a sense, agree that they're at least tied to observation, right? Or to the physical reality we live in.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll give you that. Yeah. I just wouldn't say that they themselves are empirically proven, is probably where I would drop.
Yeah. I wasn't saying empirically proven or anything like that. I was more talking about how, in principle, we could test and verify these things, or at least.
So if something falls on that spectrum of verification and believability, it should be quote unquote testable and repeatable. Is that where you're going with it? Okay, sure. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I get you. Yeah. I actually agree. I actually agree with where you're going. Sure. Yeah.
Okay. So then the next part of my question would be, to me at least, and you may differ on this, but to me at least, something that is inherently supernatural seems to be both
outside the spectrum of testable, repeatable.
Right, like something that is both unable to be investigated and unable to be understood.
Well, through what I would argue is unable to be investigated, unable to be proven through that particular methodology. So, like,
right. Yeah, speaking scientifically here.
Correct. Yeah. So, like, what we would say is that there are certain things science, by nature of its methodology, is not capable to weigh in on. There's
for the job.
It's the wrong tool for the job. Certain abstracts can't be, mathematically or scientifically quantified or tested or studied. They are simply kind of in the milieu of existence. We know they exist. We refer to them. We utilize them almost axiomatically. But in terms of any type of scientific dissection, they're beyond that realm of possibility. So the idea is that what I would argue, to bring this maybe to its final point that maybe makes this a little bit more clear, is that generally anything that would fall within the definition of quote unquote supernatural, or that which would fit that idea of the essence of that which we recognize as supernatural, would never ever be able to be tested inside the confines of something like, for instance, scientism, which only deals with this type of verification methodology through testable, repeatable. Well, if something supernatural is by essence and nature not testable, repeatable, then it's a bad idea to try to hold it to a standard of that type of verification when it's outside the spectrum of verification of that particular field of study.
Right. Yeah, I would be inclined to agree. I think that, and I'm not necessarily saying that like religion or authority or things like that are necessarily.
No, it's not an argument for that. It's just it's really a polemic to the atheist that will say something that like God should be scientifically provable or empirically provable. And the idea is that by nature of essence of what that thing we're referring to is, it can't fall within that possible spectrum of
right. Yeah, I was just gonna say I think I don't necessarily use other methods of knowledge, but I think that they are useful. I kind of just put them to the side because I don't use them that much. That's all I was gonna say. But I feel like I would agree that scientifically, at least, a supernatural entity, whatever we want to call it, basically people who say, for instance, that science proves God or science does not prove God or something
let me give you an example just real quick to maybe kind of drill this home, because this is kind of how I see the scientific view of trying to dissect the idea of just as an anecdote, say the origin of life, for instance. I would imagine a scenario where we're digging, archaeologists are digging somewhere, and we find a whole series of microbiology chambers, things that are basically, as we would recognize in modern day, some sort of abiogenesis, synthesization, protein synthesis type of lab. And we just find these uncovered, everywhere, all over the place. Like, oh, well, that's interesting. And then we see a bunch of, in stone, alien-esque type foot tracks all around the area, and then we find, the first, prokaryotes, the first, living cells, the things that were first emerged from life, with all the, minor and simplistic versions of functionality, that would have given, an idea that it possibly evolved from this singular cellular thing. What I would expect science to do, because again, science only deals in naturalistic explanations. It never, ever hypothesizes outside of the realm of naturalistic expectation. So I would expect scientists to have to say, well, rocks fell in a certain pattern to make the tracks at this particular time in Earth's history, and a bunch of rumbling of the earth and some throwing together of random materials and some lava and some refining process, and these labs were created. Because I do not expect them to ever concede or end up coming up with some sort of hypothesis that's going to do anything other than attempt to look at naturalistic explanations for literally anything, unguided naturalistic explanations. I think the field itself is orientated and geared to only answer those types of questions. Because the problem is, and I would agree with this is where the atheists actually have a little bit of a point when they say, making a quote unquote God of the gaps could inspire you to just stop looking for the answers. Because you say, well, no naturalistic mechanisms possible, let's stop looking. No, you should, but the science itself is provisional. So it's better to say, let's continue to keep looking for naturalistic explanations as much as possible. Let's make the scientific field have nothing to do with anything but looking for naturalistic explanations. But now let's not point to them and say that they're somehow making statements about theology or the existence of God. That is where I would bring it to a core end of the argument.
Right. I personally think that. I don't know how much you heard about the God of the gaps or naturalism of the gaps thing earlier.
I was listening to a little bit of it. Yeah, I've argued it for almost the year I've been here. I'm pretty familiar with it. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess. So did you also hear the prayer hypothetical I used earlier?
I may have missed that part.
Okay. So basically I was just talking about, for instance, a hospital where they're undergoing a certain process, and part of that process to heal these amputees involves prayer. And when the scientists go into it and isolate some of these other factors besides prayer, they find the prayer must be said. And to me, scientifically, you couldn't go beyond that. You couldn't say this proves God, but you also couldn't say it disproves God just by nature of the fact of what we've talked about so far.
I agree with that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So to me, at least, I don't think, and I think this is something that is often misunderstood. Not by you, obviously, but like sometimes people claim.
And by the way, I'll take this into a theological layer if you want me to. It's completely up to you.
Yeah. I think that science kind of, it doesn't disprove nor prove the supernatural in the sense that it can't. It can't really, because it kind of leaves it to the side and says, okay, this other aspect of reality or whatever we want to call it might exist, but it's not part of our objective reality that we can investigate.
Well, see, okay,
Sure.
so the whole terminology there with natural, what is nature? I mean, not to try to define God into existence, but clearly if he were the foundation of all things that exist, he would by definition be above and beyond nature, right? That's just simply how it is. And
right. Yeah. I would agree with that. I would just say that in that way we can't really reach that point based on our level of reality.
But the thing is, we can infer to the best conclusion because, okay, so we can make video games with physical, properties within the game, right? And say that you were able to make a sentient being within the video game. You gave it its properties, you gave it a specific timeline to work with, you gave it all the different laws of physics that are within the sandbox, the environment that it exists in, and it's sentient just like you and I. Would it not be able to still infer to the best conclusion that we designed it or that somebody had designed it in general? Obviously, he can't reach us. He can't go out of the system he was designed within, but doesn't mean he can't be smart enough to come to that conclusion.
Mm.
And I got to say, too, I've been keeping silent a little bit to let you guys talk, but I completely agree with what Pigs is saying because, like, to me, the idea that science doesn't obviously, if you want to use the word prove to mean definitively, I guess that, yeah, technically science doesn't prove anything at all in that way.
It doesn't.
Right.
The only thing that would be mathematics. And we do have mathematical proofs that could go as far as stating that there is an existent infinity, right? Like that is an actual
right, exactly.
state of being, right? So if that's the case, then you have to infer that there is something like that out there, right? Regardless of what that would be, it does exist, at least mathematically speaking. So
yeah,
that's
but
what
I would say too, real quick,
yeah.
and I'll pass it back to you, Pigs. I just want to say briefly, I think that I think it's totally incorrect that science doesn't actually give us any sort of proof in the more you what's the word, cultural, I guess. It's not the word I'm looking for, but there is another word out there. In the more cultural sense of using it. Say again?
More tentative sense or more colloquial sense? Or
colloquial, there you go. Thank you.
Well, and if I may maybe offer a mild clarification to kind of push with Andrew's side just ever so lightly.
I don't really have time. I got to go. But, anyways, yeah, I just wanted to say, great debate. CJ, you and Michael did a good job. Appreciate the time, though.
Absolutely.
All right,
Thank you very much for stopping in.
Hi.
So, yeah, like science is kind of by its nature provisional, as in as we add more information, our conclusions and philosophy around the data, can change, because you could have a couple premises that lead to a conclusion, have a missing third premise you're unaware of yet that brings it all together. There's an example I use of where, there's a statistic, there's a funny statistic out there that, at a particular point of the year, ice cream sales skyrocket at the same time shark attacks go up. And people, could draw from just those two premises alone that somehow the sale of ice cream increases shark attacks, but the missing third premise of consideration is the weather, the temperature. When it gets hot, people buy more ice cream and they also do more swimming. So hence more shark attacks, hence also.
Wouldn't that be something?
for ice cream sales, so you don't need to go taking axe to ice cream shops because you think you're saving people from shark attacks. But this is one of these instances. This is why that science is basically primarily always provisional, even when it constructs a deductive argument, arguably. Even in that deductive state of being of the argument with the premises they have, again, missing third premise could completely change the entire perspective. So I agree with everything everyone was saying about science almost by its nature not really able to prove much other than just give provisional statements of confidence about how we think things are right now.
Right. And oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, and so I was just going to say, is if now that we have that kind of an understanding of proof, I think that completely changes the entire line of thinking, because in that instance, not only does science give us very strong indicative reason to believe in the supernatural, but it gives us very strong indicative reason to believe in the Judeo-Christian God. And I would argue all different disciplines do. Like, for example, history, right? History by its very definition is looking into the past. It's not going to tell you anything about the nature of God or about how you get saved or about anything like that. But history can absolutely give you evidence, and one could even go as far as to say proof in a more colloquial sense, that the God of the Bible exists. For example, the resurrection of Jesus, or the stories that have to do with Moses and all that other kind of stuff, right? And in science, I think, is the exact same way. Science can absolutely give you indication that the supernatural can and must exist, and it can absolutely give you indication that God can and must exist. It may not go as far as to definitively prove those things, but I think to like hamstring the discipline entirely is something that I don't think is necessarily fair.
I guess I'd just like to add one thought, which is, science often talks about like regularity and laws, like laws of physics and so on. But those are basically meta patterns that are supposed to like describe the physical world. In a sense, they, like, if you want to talk about the origin of the laws of physics, then I mean, if laws of physics are basically like the definition of what is natural, then by definition, you're talking about something that is above nature or supernatural. And so I think if you consider science as like inference the best explanation of observed phenomena, and we have laws of physics that are derived in part through this process of inference, then you have to conclude that whatever that there has to be some origin of these laws of physics by the same observation that would justify you in believing those laws of physics exist in the first place, because everything ultimately needs an explanation.
Well, but you're if I may, I'm sorry, just to interject briefly, and I actually do have to go, but I just want to add this one thing.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to leave too soon.
Yeah, and good chat, Andrew.
Yeah,
appreciate
likewise.
Yeah, nice exchange. Appreciate that with you. But yeah, you still have to rely upon some sort of axiomatic justification, non-justified, even to accept the idea that the laws of physics have perhaps, say, a natural origin, as opposed to what a Christian presupposition, axiomatic presupposition, would be, which is that they are eternal in the sense that they are abstract, eternal in the mind of God. Since God is an eternal being, everything of a component of his mind, including his mental intention to the creation of reality, are all co-eternal along with him. So this is it's a very, very complicated way for us to try to put our brains into a eternal non-linear time space, but that's essentially what's going on. That's why we have such a hard time unequivocating. We're talking about God in his own essence, in terms of how he exists outside of our own, three-dimensional time space. That's why when we have concepts like the Trinity, we can only refer to him analogically. We don't have the ability to say, hey, that thing over there, that's just like God. We can only point at something and say, well, that is kind of like God. This is where we get the Trinity concept of using person. We don't actually mean person in the three-dimensional separate of individual person. We mean like a supra-person, or a personage that would exist in, say, for instance, like a fourth-dimensional, fifth-dimensional, sixth-dimensional state, where time itself now has a different meaning, and personage in and of itself also has a different meaning, if that helps. But I have to go. I appreciate it, guys, and thanks for having me. And CJ, have yourself a good afternoon. Thank you, guys.
Yes, Boogie, thanks for the chat.
No.
Yeah, absolutely. So then, if there's anything else anybody wanted to talk about, I guess that would probably, we'll probably get to wrapping up here pretty soon. It is almost about on 3 hours.
Yeah. I gotta get something to eat. I haven't had lunch yet, so.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. We didn't end up actually talking about any of the 3 things that I offered people to challenge me on, but that's perfectly fine. Nobody wanted to challenge.
I'm sorry if I had a part to play in that.
Oh no, it's all good. I mean, really, what it is if nobody was interested in coming in and talking about those things, then that's the way the audience feels, right? Like, I'm glad to have people here watching and us, doing something that, in my view, is very solidly a pursuit of truth, which of course I take from a Christian perspective. So regardless of where it happens to go, I'm perfectly fine. These open mics tend to do that sort of thing.
Yeah. And I think, even though I disagree with probably a lot of stuff some people in this panel have said so far, and people have left, I still think you can still have a good, cordial, nice chat and learn something from each other, even at least entertainment wise, you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and even, I would even say from a perspective even greater than that, I do think that, these kind of conversations can absolutely lead to people to get, farther along in their pursuit of actual truth, which I've always had a firm philosophical conviction that pursuit of truth is sort of like the ultimate meaning of life. Even before I was a Christian. That's obviously my own philosophical opinions, but, nonetheless, I think it's an important thing.
Yep.
Does anyone else have anything they wanted to add before we probably wind down here?
Not really.
Is Crimson back?
I'm not sure there, but either way, I do appreciate everybody for showing up. If anybody does at any point in time want to challenge me on any of the 3 things I offered here, and did not end up watching this at this point in time, comment in the comments section below on this video once it's already been posted and not live and all that kind of stuff. And we'll organize something maybe specifically for that topic if you happen to have a lot of people also wanting, or if you happen to be somebody who's another apologist wants to come talk to me. We can all do that sort of thing. I'll just reiterate, just because I want to poke bears a little bit. I think the Earth is absolutely young, and there is no possible way you can understand the Bible being old Earth unless you were assuming things from outside the text. I think that there are very solid reasons to believe in a deity, including but not limited to biblical prophecy, miracle, personal experience, teleological argument, Kalam argument, so on and so forth. And that would be with my debate with Michael, obviously, the first one being my debate with Kenny. And also, I think that the NIFB are dangerous. I think that they are a cult, and I think their opinions on theocracy and reprobation are laughable. And I will challenge anybody on that. In fact, if you guys are seeing this video and you happen to be around people like, for example, Matt Powell, Stephen Anderson, other NIFB leaders, any of them who do actually debate, go ahead and let them know that I challenge them and would absolutely love to give them their before the foundation of the world foreordained spanking on, of course, live YouTube stream. And I say that a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I also really don't like NIFB theology, so I'm actually trying to be a little aggressive with it. Nonetheless, if you guys did appreciate this video, please like, please share. Please consider subscribing if you like this content. Hit the bell if you want to get notified every time we go live. And of course, if you feel led, if you feel that I am worth it, if you feel that this is deserving of some level of career in my field, please do consider giving to the Patreon. Obviously, I want to earn it from you guys, so don't do it just because of just because I'm asking, right? Do it if you actually think it's worth it. And thank you to the ones who watched as much of this as you possibly can, because that is actually the number one thing you can do for a YouTube algorithm. Likes, shares, and all that sort of stuff help tremendously, but watching as much of the video as you possibly can is actually what boosts it more than anything else in the algorithm, so I appreciate that stuff tremendously. Want to say, lastly, blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. This has been Un-Apologetics. If the Lord wills and tarries, we will see you here soon.